Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Frontier Opening Bell. I am Bosi Namafayi here in Lagos. Let's get today's show started. Let me go straight first and introduce my panelists. Ali Khan Sacho, who is the CEO and founder at Rich Frontiers Management, is joining us out of Nairobi. Good morning, Ali. I hope Nairobi is great and good this morning. And joining us also on the show today is Wale Olusi, who is the head of research at United Capital. Wale is back in the office today, I guess for the first time in a number of weeks. So there is looking squeezy as the Nigerian authorities reopen the country, Africa's largest economy, for wider businesses. Nigeria's GDP came in slightly positive in the first quarter, but it looks like the country has to reopen. The country's PMI, manufacturing numbers for the month of May, came in yesterday, dived down to 42.4 reading from 51.1 earlier. So the authorities had no choice than to ask banks to reopen for business, longer hours, and a few other businesses as well. But there's still guidelines in terms of social distancing and all of that. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But let's quickly take a look at how some of the big markets on the African continent finished off yesterday. This is just a sample of the 5 of the markets that will cover for you. On the Nigerian stock market came in a positive 0.19%. Some buying in by investors on the big names like Boa Cement and others. The Ivory Coast BRVM was 0.61% positive on the composite index. The Egyptian market also about 0.1% in the green, while the Kenyan market finished, that's the Friday number, 137.13. Ali will bring us up to speed on the Nairobi Securities Exchange, as well as the South African market, reading almost 1% positive, 50,000 at the doorstep of 51,000. So let's just go straight to East Africa and look through some of the big stories there. I'm sure Kenya Airways is one of the big stories there in terms of the bailouts and how this company continue to trade and try to stay out of troubled weather. But again, if you look at the Nairobi or the East African markets a little bit deeper, you find that the Kenya SBM Bank reported a net profit that's down to about 63.6 million shillings in Q1, while the Central Bank of Kenya is looking at there may be problems with the SMEs because about 75 of them has no credit buffers. So let's just ask Ali straight to bring us up to speed here on the East African market. So Ali, come into this conversation here. Take it from me.
Yes, so thank you, Bison. We were closed yesterday. It was our Madaraka Day, so that's why the market was unchanged. Just to touch on some of the stories that you were referring to, Kenya Airways, obviously, Bison, like all African airlines, in real pickle. I know in South Africa, we've had the government look at a bailout or a restructuring. Kenya Airways pivoted to cargo, a little bit like Ethiopian, then learned it couldn't compete. So it's struggling. We've got a negative capital position on the balance sheet of about $1 billion. And the government strategy, Boasson, is to try and merge Kenya Airways with Kenya Airports Authority. Kenya Airports Authority runs the airport and all the other airports in the country and has a lot of land. So what the government is trying to do is to essentially put those two together and then utilize the balance sheet, the land equity that's sitting in Kenya Airports Authority. That is the strategy, I think, to save the airline. But I, for one, am very pessimistic about a rapid pickup in air traffic and in tourism. Tourism is another sector which has been hit very hard. 2 iconic hotels, Norfolk, very famous, about 100 years old. One of the most iconic hotels in Nairobi has closed down entirely. Serena Hotels, which is listed at the stock market, Norfolk isn't. Serena, big hotel chain here in East Africa, they've sent everybody home and shut down all their hotels as well. So we're seeing a lot of negative spillover. The stock market is uncertain what to do. We have what I would call, and I wouldn't put Serena in that category, but a lot of zombie companies which are essentially technically in default. They're still trading at the stock exchange for pennies on the shilling, and this has been quite a challenge. Just to touch on a couple of other issues, we were speaking about the opening up earlier before we started the show, and the economy here. This is a big challenge in Kenya. When do we open up? People are expecting an opening up to happen. And then really this big curveball, the report of Ebola in DR Congo. You can't imagine 2020, and then that comes along. There's been 4 cases, so people are a bit concerned about that as well. And just to touch on South Africa, where we're seeing an opening up as well, the Rand traded off a little bit. The stock market's been strong. Rand highly correlated to this sort of China-US trade war and perceived stress in that relationship. JSE highly correlated to the Dow, and they've printed so much money that's holding up the Dow at the moment, and that's spilling over into the JSE, which is the most correlated to developed markets of any of our sub-Saharan African markets. But essentially, we're all facing the same challenges. When do we open up? All our economies have slowed to a standstill, and I think this is the big issue for policymakers, whether they're in Lagos, Nairobi, or Pretoria.
Very interesting. The same issue. So if we take a look at the Nigerian markets very quickly, despite the lockdown and the impact of the global issues and challenges, the Nigerian market finished up about 0.2% yesterday, positive reading. But the reopening of the economy is one big issue. Nigerian borders with the land borders is yet to be reopened. The international airports not yet reopened for international flights. Local flights are reopening or back in business may take about 2-3 weeks down the line. Then we have news that Airtel Africa annual general meeting is later this month on the 24th, about 3 weeks from now, and the shareholders will be looking to approve about 0.03 American dollars as dividend. But again, Airtel also in the annual statement says it is seeking resolution by the shareholders at the June 24 meeting to start funding political parties and political candidates, but setting a ceiling of £25,000 as what can be approved by the company or the subsidiaries to fund political parties and independent candidates. That's one big story that will come out of Airtel Africa's annual general meeting on the 24th, and I'm sure this is one big story. All of you who are analysts will be looking into how will Airtel Africa intend to move forward, announcing publicly that it's going to start authorizing funding of political parties, political candidates at £25,000. What's it all about? That's a conversation for another day. But again, if you look at Ghana, like Nigeria is setting new rules in relation to share price movement and the number of shares that you need. Wale Olusi, coming here into the conversation very quickly. Weighing on the Nigerian market, please.
For the Nigerian market, I think some of the news that you mentioned initially around, further easing of economic activity that, the presidential task force announced yesterday, I think is expected to give further momentum to the market. I was just checking the numbers just now. The market has been rallying for about 8 out of the last 10 trading days. I think with what is happening to oil prices and, these new guidelines, investors' optimism will be further strengthened, definitely. So what we're expecting is, a continuation of the rally that we've seen. Then speaking to Airtel Africa and, funding political, activities, I think the company is probably just being strategic. Clearly, in the post-COVID world, the telecom sector is going to be one of the most strategic sector, and, they want to have all their cards in the right place to be able to also shape policy perhaps, or support the candidate of their choice, get the right thing in place to protect, not only the interest of their shareholders, but to also maximize, the opportunities in the economy by making sure those that they think will get the necessary, policy guidelines in place for them to be profitable, for them to, remain in business, for them to compete, in a very, very competitive sector that they find themselves in. Is actually a little bit oligopolistic, with the likes of MTN also playing very strongly in that space. So I think that's what Airtel is looking at. But for investors, investors want to know, what is going to happen to their bottom line numbers. The share price here in Nigeria has not, been moving a lot. It has been, very, very flattish, unlike MTN. I think there are still concerns around the size of their leverage. Maybe when they take some of that out and they start reporting numbers that excite investor at the bottom line level, then we will start seeing more activities on Airtel.
Okay, let's quickly bring in Uchenna. Thank you so much, Wale. Uchenna is managing partner at FX Trader, Blue FX. Nigeria is seeing some accretion into its FX results. The foreign loans are coming in. Oil prices have been steady around $38 a barrel. And of course, we're seeing a bit of moderation in terms of the support to the currency is still there. So, do you think it's still early days to say the central bank has enough bullets in its weapons to prevent this more talked about devaluation or major meltdown in the naira-dollar relationship?
I think oil prices rebounding is sort of coming at a very pivotal time for the central bank, given how much it is. We're going to continue to have a bolstering in our FX reserve. That also, as Wale has mentioned, has created some sort of calmness for investors to see that they can come into this market and try to get in on the undervalued asset and owned asset. Yeah. So I think that sentiment, that bullish sentiment, is starting to play. But yes, there's still the risk if this might be too early to start to consolidate in terms of coming into this market space, which is also having that sort of strengthening effect, ripple effect into the naira. But I think we need to still continue to cautiously watch in the next 1 to 2 months to see what the external global risk would continue to precipitate, to see if that would be an issue. But if we get to see maybe the coronavirus pandemic flattening and cases reducing, even here in Nigeria, I think we might start looking at the borders being opened and having more international trading dynamics.
Let's talk about the South African market, Southern African markets a bit. Our petrol prices is set to go up, I think tomorrow or day after in South Africa. Petrol prices will go up about 9.7%. Diesel will be up by about 2%. In Nigeria, we just had an announcement overnight that the Petrol Products Pricing Regulatory Agency says petrol prices in Nigeria will decline. Nigeria is now going to implement something similar to South Africa in terms of doing monthly price adjustment for the pump price of petrol products. But again, I'm sure you're looking at the screen right now. Al, in terms of the PMI, Nigeria's PMI came in 42.4. That's below water. 50 is the benchmark when you talk about a PMI reading. So then you're looking at Botswana, which is one of the economies down there in Southern Africa. Well, what's your take on the Southern Africa, the South Africa's PMI, petrol prices, reopening the economy, getting everybody back to business?
So obviously, the PMI report that we're seeing out of Nigeria is a symptom of a disease we're seeing all across the continent. I can't think of any PMI currently, that is showing any expansion. I mean, this is a symptom of the lockdown, of the controls that were brought in place a few months ago. And until we reopen our economies and we get the engine motoring, we're going to see very weak PMI numbers. We've had the same trend here in Nairobi. Static PMI has been in contraction practically all year, and we're seeing that across the board. So I think that really is a scientific confirmation of the lockdown effect that we've seen. Our numbers aren't as bad as somewhere like India, where you've completely collapsed because the lockdown has been much more restrictive. Just to give you an example, in South Africa, obviously last month, the last 4 weeks of May, in the 4 weeks in May, we had the biggest ever monthly gain in the price of oil. So, you know, consumers in South Africa have benefited from much lower oil prices. Now you're getting a little bit of an increase, but overall for consumers, not for producers like yourselves, but for consumers, these are good times when it comes to the price of fuel. The issue with many countries, and in Kenya, for example, is the amount of tax that the government puts on fuel. Here in Kenya, more than 50% of the price that you pay at the pump is actually tax. So even if the price dropped to zero, we'd still be paying a significant amount for our fuel. That's just a fact of life. Touching on Botswana, which you touched on, look, Botswana is the best credit in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, without exception. So I was quite surprised that I think it was Moody's putting them on negative watch. You know, they run a very conservative balance sheet in Gaborone. They are the most conservative folks on the whole continent. And I think, you know, they haven't really gone crazy or spent great deal of money. I think they've been supporting employees with a 50% support. So they're paying employers 50% of the salary. That ends at the end of June, as far as I'm aware. And I thought that was a little bit too drastic. I can think of worse cases than Botswana, in my view. So looking at Southern Africa, I think a lot will depend on South Africa. A lot will depend on the bounce back, because that will create a positive spillover across there. But for now, I think, you know, we've got to wait and see. There are no clear signals, and it just feels as if, you know, the external environment remains very, very soft, and South Africa depends a great deal on the external environment as well.
Interesting, Ali. But again, if you look at the global space right now, China overnight announced about $60 billion intervention of monies in small businesses through the banks. Saudi Arabia yesterday announced about $15 billion, which it says will go into the banking system to prop up the bank. So if you look at the bank's earnings, and do you think the central banks in Africa has what it takes to also boost the banks? Again, you look at the position of these banks on the various exchanges. Wale Olusi, coming here into this, how much of the bailouts has been spread to small businesses, to healthcare sector and all of that? Now the banks' attention is focused coming to them. Do you think the banks need bailouts? If yes, and if no, do you think it will have any impact on how their earnings will turn out in 2020?
Well, I mean, it is always a debate as to whether you need to bail out the bank or just focus on the most vulnerable units in the economy. Because, I mean, the banks are always suggested to be big, and, you know, they make all the profit. They declare this huge profit every year. But the thing with the bank is, because they are heavily exposed, for example, if you look at the highest hit sectors as a result of this pandemic, you talk about tourism, you talk about hospitality, you know, you talk about the oil and gas sector and a few other sectors, and you look at, you know, the impact of how this will affect their balance sheet once all of these facilities that are supporting the balance sheet, you know, once those incomes stop coming, you know, you have a guy that took mortgage, set up a restaurant, and so on, you know, because of the pandemic or the lockdown, he can't fund the borrowing that he has taken from the bank. And then, you know, the bank goes down. So it's always a debate. Should you bail out the bank or bail out the guy who is the unit? I think some people are of the opinion that maybe you should actually bail out the guy with the restaurant so that he can continue to run his business. Then he can meet up with the facility he has with the bank. But I think the support most of the time has always been for the bank who are being bailed out, to stay in business, probably because they are more systemic. They employ a lot of people, and these people also contribute. So at times it look like a chicken and egg situation where you really don't know. So, but here in Nigeria, what we've seen is a situation where there's been a lot of support for the guys at the SME level. There's a lot of central bank intervention fund at 5% to make sure those people, even households, that probably lost jobs due to the pandemic, they are being, bailed out as a result of this pandemic. So I think, it depends on the economy you are looking at. Government can weigh the pros and the cons and choose which side of the coin to actually direct its support efforts to.
Okay, quick one. We need to wrap up in about 2 minutes or 3 minutes or so. Let's take a quick look at the North African markets. Ali, I want to see if you have any thoughts around any of these markets. Morocco is I think the second largest market north of the continent. That's the free float index up about 1% yesterday. The FTSE Casablanca Stock Exchange, that's the CSC Morocco, top 15 up almost 0.7%. The second item has to do with the suspension of course, an equity securities on the bond. But again, the exchange, the Casablanca Stock Exchange, is rejigging the monthly volume threshold for its share repurchase deal. So it's kind of a securities lending arrangement. I'm sure Wale Lucy knows what we're doing in Nigeria with that. Then the EGX, that Egyptian market, marginally led by the banking stock. So Ali, give us 1 minute here on your thoughts on the North African markets. Egypt is always big there with Morocco. But what's the story? Is there anything that we need to rev up one or two more? The Tunisian market, for example, or maybe the Algerian stock market.
So I think my takeaway is that, as the market begins to normalize globally, the first amount of foreign investor flows will come into that North African market. So we keep an eye, because that's what's going to be an early signal as in international investor appetite returns. Morocco is an interesting place, and so is Egypt, heavily dependent on tourism. Millions of people go to both destinations. So I think, again, that will be interesting to see. We're seeing an opening up in Southern Europe. The question is, will they extend that to North Africa? And I think that would be a very bullish signal for those economies. Interesting reports I saw finally, Egyptian pound was considered very overvalued according to a fund manager report. I tend to disagree with that. Egypt, of course, and the rest of North Africa has been hit harder by the COVID-19 and still remains quite elevated. But my key takeaway is these markets will rebound first on international demand returning. And I think that will be an early signal for the rest of sub-Saharan Africa is my takeaway for now.
Okay, thank you. I think we need to start wrapping up. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds each, Wale and Ali, to give me about 30 seconds. What's your take on the opening bell for the Nigerian market today? Wale, quickly.
Okay, I mean, I think with what we saw yesterday from the president, as well as what is happening in the oil market rallied to 37, 38 yesterday. So the Nigerian market typically, swing along with the oil market. And with further easing in the economy, I think investors' confidence will be boosted. We should expect, a bullish sentiment in the Nigerian market today.
Okay, thank you. Ali, give us your take on the East Coast.
So on the East Coast, what we've got is the Nairobi Stock Exchange. If you whip out Safaricom, is at a 20-year low. So I think what we're seeing now is a bargain hunting, low volume, but people looking to pick up, key stocks. Obviously, Safaricom, it's interesting you're talking about Airtel Africa before. Safaricom has demolished Airtel in our market, right? It's a dominant player looking at entering into Ethiopia, haven't made a firm decision. But I think in Nairobi, we're looking at a basing formation and hopefully will turn gradually higher over the next few sessions. But obviously, a lot will depend on the US, I think, where I'm worried the US market is looking very overvalued to me. And if that tends to roll over, I think we'll see rolling over in a lot of other equity markets as well.
Thank you so much, Ali. In other Frontier Africa news, of course, the Kenya Airways story remained very a big one there for investors across Africa to consider. Kenya Airways is still hanging in there. In other news, we saw the Statistics Office in Kenya talking about more job losses. Uganda Parliament, said 3 trillion shillings to finance its upcoming budget. Of course, the June 4th meeting is also there for the OPEC. That'll be a big story for us on Thursday. Meantime, we need to consider tomorrow is the 6th anniversary of Nigeria's central bank governor taking office as Nigeria's central bank chief. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being on the show today on Frontier Open Bell. Ali Khan from Nairobi, Wale Olusi from Lagos. Thank you very much. We lost Uche Naminis there earlier, a bit of a very patchy network this morning here in Lagos. Thank you, gentlemen, and I'll see you again tomorrow. I am Bosi Nomofaye. Do have a great day, everyone.